For months, whispers filled the palace halls, rumors that Princess Catherine was fighting a battle even the crown could not shield her from. But today, in a revelation no one saw coming, her doctor stepped forward and confirmed what many dared not believe. Catherine's health has taken a miraculous turn. The announcement hit like thunder, rattling not just the gates of Buckingham, but echoing across every corner of the world. After endless speculation, silence, and carefully worded palace statements, the truth had finally pierced through, and it was far more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. The secrecy surrounding Catherine's condition had created an air of dread that never seemed to lift. Every time she was absent from a public appearance, every time her smile faded behind the heavy palace curtains, questions grew louder. Was the future Queen Consort silently slipping away? The monarchy refused to answer, their carefully maintained wall of silence only fueling suspicion. Courtiers whispered of hushed consultations with physicians, while tabloids filled their front pages with grim predictions. In the absence of clarity, the world imagined the worst. And then came the doctor's words, simple, firm, and unforgettable. He described her recovery not as progress, not even as unexpected, but as miraculous. At that moment, the world collectively gasped. What did he mean by miraculous? What had truly happened behind those heavily guarded palace doors? Even seasoned royal correspondents, who had weathered decades of shocking headlines, admitted they had never witnessed a revelation delivered with such gravity. Insiders confessed they were as blindsided as the press. Palace staff, who had spent weeks watching Catherine drift in and out of view, their faces etched with concern, now spoke in hushed awe. Some described the revelation as otherworldly, as though fate itself had intervened. The use of such a loaded word, miraculous, raised eyebrows, not only within Britain, but among international audiences who could not comprehend how a woman once believed to be fighting for her very survival could suddenly stand on the threshold of renewed life. The media frenzy was instant and ferocious. Within minutes, the announcement eclipsed every headline, every broadcast. Across social networks, hashtags exploded, with millions around the globe declaring their relief, their disbelief, and their prayers answered. The narrative shifted from mourning what might have been to celebrating what was suddenly possible again. Catherine, once a figure hidden in shadows, became the emblem of resilience. The monarchy itself, often accused of hiding behind outdated rituals, now found itself thrust into the spotlight of hope. But not everyone accepted the revelation at face value. Some asked if this was truly a divine sign or a carefully managed truth designed to steady a trembling throne. Could the doctor's words have been chosen not only for their medical weight, but for their symbolic power? After all, the crown thrives not just on lineage, but on faith. Faith of the people, faith in destiny, faith that the monarchy is more than mere mortals bound by illness or age. Catherine's miraculous recovery, whether born of medicine, miracle, or manipulation, arrived at the very moment the monarchy needed a story of renewal. The tension was palpable. Was this the hand of Providence, saving the woman destined to be queen, or the careful crafting of a narrative to protect the institution? One thing was certain, Catherine's story had crossed into legend, and the world would not turn away. Her recovery was not just about health, it was about hope, power, and destiny, colliding in a single moment. But to understand why this revelation feels like destiny itself, we must trace back to the darkest days, when even her family feared the worst. Behind the radiant smile and graceful composure, Catherine was fighting an invisible storm, one so severe it nearly tore her away from her family and the future of the monarchy itself. To the world, she appeared serene, graceful, untouchable. Yet, beneath the polished appearances, there were subtle cracks only a few could see. A fleeting look of exhaustion, a longer absence than usual, a hand clutched to her side when she thought no one was watching. These were the signs of a woman silently enduring a battle her crown could not protect her from, and while most overlooked them, those closest to her knew the truth. She was slipping further into the shadows. Prince William, bound by both love and duty, tried desperately to shield her from the piercing gaze of the public. He rearranged schedules, canceled appearances at the last moment, and kept official explanations vague, hoping to buy Catherine time and privacy. Yet, even in his efforts, the truth bled through. His face grew more tense, his eyes more burdened, and the warmth he once carried into every engagement was dulled by worry. To those paying attention, William's silence spoke louder than words, and it became clear that his attempts to guard her only confirmed the gravity of what was unfolding. Even the children of those innocent heirs who carried the promise of tomorrow revealed glimpses of the toll Catherine's illness was taking. Close aides recalled moments when young George appeared unusually quiet, when Charlotte clung too tightly to her father's hand, or when Louis asked questions no child should need to ask about their mother's strength. These small but powerful signals betrayed the truth no palace statement could conceal. The entire family was living in the shadow of Catherine's struggle. Behind palace doors, the atmosphere grew heavy with what insiders described as a ghostly silence. Hallways that once rang with laughter and routine now echoed with unease. Aides avoided speaking her name in casual conversation, their loyalty binding them to secrecy, but their eyes betraying fear. The most trusted royal staffers admitted later that they had never felt the palace so frozen, as if time itself had paused to wait for the outcome of Catherine's unseen war. Royal doctors, sworn to protect both patient and institution, allegedly weighed unprecedented measures. Quiet consultations were held in hidden chambers, where options outside the realm of traditional medicine were debated. These were discussions rarely admitted to experimental treatments, risky interventions, and unconventional therapies that revealed just how desperate the situation had become. The very mention of such measures was enough to make even the most loyal confidants realize the monarchy was bracing for the unthinkable. As Catherine's appearances grew fewer and fewer, speculation exploded outside the palace gates. Each absence fueled darker rumors. Each postponement whispered of decline. Tabloids declared her too fragile to fulfill royal duties, while conspiracy theories spread like wildfire, suggesting truths darker than anyone dared confirm. To the watching world, her disappearance from public life felt like a countdown, and the silence from within only magnified the dread. The monarchy, already burdened by uncertainty and the king's frailty, now seemed poised on the brink of losing its brightest light. Every day, Catherine remained unseen. The nation's hope dimmed further. It was as if Britain itself was holding its breath, waiting for an inevitable tragedy. And then, just when despair seemed inevitable, something extraordinary happened. Something that defied all medical predictions. In a press room that had grown used to denial, one man's words cut through the silence. Princess Catherine has made a miraculous recovery. Gasps filled the air. The impossible had been spoken. For weeks, the atmosphere had been one of guarded statements, carefully crafted lines that offered neither hope nor despair. But in a single sentence, the palace's silence was shattered, and the world was hurled into a moment so powerful that even seasoned reporters confessed they had never experienced anything like it. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as though history had paused to allow those words to sink in. The doctor's voice was steady, deliberate, and unshakable. He chose each word with care, repeating that this was not merely progress, not simply an improvement, but something far greater. Miraculous. The phrasing was unlike anything expected from a medical professional, and it reverberated through the chamber with an almost mystical force. Reporters scrambled to capture every syllable, their hands trembling, their eyes wide, as if witnessing the rewriting of destiny itself. One journalist later described the atmosphere as electric and unreal, while another said it felt like the ground had shifted beneath us. The line between science and faith seemed to blur in that moment, leaving even the most skeptical frozen in awe. Yet, even as his words spread across every broadcast and digital platform, questions erupted like wildfire. Why now? Why this phrasing? And why had the palace waited so long to acknowledge her condition if this recovery was so profound? Medical records, which many expected would follow such a declaration, were conspicuously absent. Instead, the doctor offered nothing more than a statement of certainty, leaving the press and the public to wrestle with the enormity of what had just been confirmed. The lack of documentation only deepened the mystery. Was this recovery a product of traditional medicine, or had something far more unconventional taken place behind the palace walls? Whispers quickly surfaced claims of experimental treatments, undisclosed therapies, and even spiritual practices that ordinary doctors would never admit to. Some insiders hinted at rituals of prayer and silence, others spoke of unprecedented medical options, but none could provide proof. The secrecy surrounding Catherine's journey made the doctor's announcement feel all the more otherworldly, as though her survival itself was wrapped in mystery. Even senior royals were said to be blindsided by the timing of the announcement. Advisors close to King Charles reportedly expected another month of quiet recovery before any statement was made. Yet here was Catherine's physician, boldly proclaiming before the world that she had triumphed over the odds. The suddenness of it all sparked both relief and unease. Relief that she had been spared. Unease that the revelation had bypassed even the monarchy's most careful machinery of control. For a family that thrives on order, the unpredictability of this moment was as staggering as the news itself. The declaration changed everything. Catherine was no longer just a patient recovering behind palace doors. She was now a symbol of survival, a figure whose strength had transcended medical predictions and whose story had taken on the weight of legend. Whether her recovery was divine, experimental, or a carefully guarded miracle of science, the effect was the same. She had been placed in the realm of destiny. But this wasn't just a medical story, it was a deeply spiritual moment, one that connected Catherine to the legacy of queens before her. For centuries, Britain has looked for signs from above when the monarchy trembles. Now, many believe Catherine's recovery is nothing less than divine intervention. It was not simply a story of health regained. It was interpreted as a message written in fate itself, a reminder that the crown has always been bound to forces greater than politics or medicine. At a moment when the institution wavered under the weight of uncertainty, her survival was seen as proof that the monarchy was not abandoned, but preserved for a higher purpose. The echoes of history were unmistakable. Britain has long told tales of queens who defied the odds, women who outlived the whispers of death and emerged stronger, reshaping the nation in their resilience. In Catherine, many saw a continuation of that lineage, an heir to the strength of Elizabeth I, to the grace of Victoria, to the endurance of Elizabeth II. Each of these women had been tested, and now Catherine stood among them, surviving against predictions that should have ended her story. Her recovery became more than a personal triumph. It was elevated into legend. In hushed chapels and cathedrals, clergy began quietly referring to her recovery as heaven's message. They spoke of answered prayers, of divine timing too precise to dismiss as coincidence. They whispered that Catherine had been chosen, that her survival was an affirmation of destiny. Across the country, thousands who had lit candles and held vigils now declared their faith had been rewarded. They saw her strength as the answer to cries that had risen night after night, a sign that the monarchy had been spared collapse by divine will. The timing was impossible to ignore. Public vigils that had begun as mournful gatherings shifted into celebrations almost overnight. As prayers were lifted in cathedrals, news of Catherine's recovery emerged, creating the sense that the two were intertwined, that a nation's collective faith had reached heaven. And heaven had responded. For those who believed, there was no doubt. This was providence. Her recovery also came at a moment of deep fragility for the crown. King Charles's own health had cast long shadows over the monarchy's future, feeding doubts about stability. Into that darkness, Catherine's return became a symbol of light, a figure of hope rising even as the king weakened. She embodied endurance, grace, and the continuity that the nation craved. It was as though destiny itself had shifted the focus away from decline and toward renewal. The comparisons to Diana soon followed. Diana, too, had been cast as a figure tied to fate, someone whose presence carried a spiritual weight that transcended her role. Now Catherine was spoken of in the same breath, another woman whose life and struggles seemed woven into something larger than the crown itself. Many whispered that Diana's spirit lived on through Catherine, guiding her survival as a torch passed from one generation to the next. The monarchy, aware of its need to regain the public's faith, seized the narrative with urgency. Court officials leaned into the language of miracles, allowing Catherine's recovery to become not only a personal story, but a symbol of national endurance. What better way to restore faith in a fractured institution than through a living miracle? Her survival was framed as proof that the crown was blessed, watched over, and destined to endure. But miracles rarely come without conflict, and behind palace doors, this recovery sparked more than celebration. It ignited a power struggle. As Catherine's health returned, Prince William wept openly, but King Charles's silence was deafening. Was it pride or fear of what her recovery now meant for the balance of power? To those closest to William, his emotions were uncontainable. He had carried the weight of despair in private, fearing he might lose not only his wife, but the cornerstone of his future reign. Her survival felt to him like a second chance, a gift that could not be measured in titles or crowns. His tears were not of weakness, but of gratitude, overflowing relief after months of dread. Yet, as William's joy radiated, his father's silence cast a long shadow. Within palace corridors, whispers grew louder. Charles was unsettled, perhaps even threatened. For years, his reign had been overshadowed by doubts, critics pointing to his health, his age, and the fractured loyalty of the public. Catherine's sudden resurgence, so unexpected and celebrated, shifted the spotlight away from the king and onto his daughter-in-law. Insiders claimed the monarch felt as though the throne itself was slipping from under him, not by abdication, but by sheer force of Catherine's growing presence. What should have been a unifying moment for the family instead became another fault line. Advisors, ever watchful of public opinion, warned Charles that Catherine's rise was more than symbolic. They described her recovery as creating a rising star effect, pulling attention and affection toward her in a way that eclipsed the king's carefully guarded image. While Charles battled illness and the weight of responsibility, Catherine now embodied strength, survival, and hope. To the nation, she seemed chosen, protected by Providence itself. To a king struggling to hold together the fragile perception of stability, it was both a blessing and a threat. This unspoken rivalry strained the father-son bond. William, basking in relief, found himself frustrated by his father's lack of warmth. He longed for a moment of shared joy, an embrace that acknowledged not only Catherine's recovery, but the unity of their family. Instead, Charles's silence grew heavier, his restraint interpreted by many as distance, even coldness. The divide between them deepened, not through words spoken, but through words withheld. What might have been a season of healing was instead clouded by suspicion and competing visions of the crown's future. And in the middle of it all was Catherine herself. Loved deeply by William, she became the anchor that steadied his spirit. Yet at the same time, she felt the weight of Charles's gaze not hostile, but questioning. It was as though the king himself was struggling to decide whether to see her as an ally in preserving the monarchy or a rival pulling the narrative away from him. For Catherine, the miracle of her survival came with a new burden, the role of unintentional disruptor, a figure caught between joy and suspicion, love and silence. Her recovery, instead of uniting the crown, revealed fractures that had always lingered beneath the surface. William's tears were raw, Charles's silence was calculated, and the distance between them widened with every passing day. The monarchy, at its core, was never just about titles, it was about perception. And in Catherine's return, perception had shifted irrevocably. But if the king's silence was unsettling, Queen Camilla's reaction was explosive, and it revealed a deeper wound in the monarchy. Sources claim Queen Camila stormed out of a meeting, furious that Catherine's recovery overshadowed her position. "She's stealing the crown before it's even placed," Camilla reportedly snapped. For years, she had fought to carve out her place in a monarchy that never fully embraced her. And just when she thought her influence had solidified, Catherine's miraculous return shattered that fragile ground. What should have been a celebration of renewed health became, for Camilla, a direct threat to her standing not only as Queen Consort, but as the woman beside a king whose reign was already fragile. The press wasted no time in making the divide clear. Almost overnight, headlines that once revolved around Camilla's role at Charles's side turned entirely to Catherine. Newspapers that had previously analyzed Camilla's influence now splashed Catherine's smiling face across their front pages, calling her the embodiment of resilience and the future of the monarchy. The pivot was brutal and swift, leaving Camilla feeling as though the years she spent clawing her way to legitimacy had been erased in an instant. For a woman who had endured decades of scorn to finally reach the throne, Catherine's rise threatened to undo everything. Behind palace doors, whispers leaked that Camilla had even referred to Catherine's recovery as a staged miracle. Whether said in anger or in genuine suspicion, the comment revealed the bitterness boiling beneath the surface. To Camilla, the timing was too perfect, the narrative too neat. A woman thought to be on the brink of collapse suddenly returned to the spotlight, hailed as divinely chosen. It was, in Camilla's eyes, a story designed to sideline her at the very moment when she was supposed to be consolidating power as queen. Family gatherings, once already delicate affairs, grew strained beyond repair. Sources described dinners where silence hung heavy, where Camilla's barbed remarks were met with William's icy glare. Catherine, caught in the crossfire, bore the weight of veiled hostility, while William shielded her with quiet but fierce resolve. He refused to let his wife face Camilla's words alone, stepping in whenever sharp tones rose too high. The tension was no longer hidden. It seeped into every corner of the royal household, leaving even longtime aides whispering of a household split between two women whose very existence seemed at odds. The whispers of the people, however, told a different story. To them, Catherine was now the true queen, the woman chosen not by coronation, but by fate itself. Every time she stepped into the public eye, her presence radiated legitimacy, and the chants of the crowds reflected that shift. What the monarchy's image builders could not fabricate, Catherine's story was created naturally. Her survival had elevated her into a symbol greater than her title, and Camila could do nothing to stop the tide. For Camila, this was more than jealousy. It was fear. Fear that her influence over the king was waning, fear that the institution she had finally claimed a place within would turn its back on her, and fear that the woman the public adored would eclipse her entirely. In the shadows of Catherine's recovery, Camila saw not triumph, but betrayal, not miracle, but threat. And as tension burned behind palace walls, the nation outside was already rallying, demanding that Catherine's miracle mark a new chapter for the monarchy. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting her name not as princess, but as queen. For the people, Catherine's recovery was proof she was chosen. What began as solemn vigils, where candles flickered in silence, had now transformed into jubilant celebrations, the air charged with triumph rather than grief. Strangers embraced, voices lifted in song, and banners proclaiming Catherine as the nation's hope waved defiantly against the palace gates. It was no longer just relief that she had survived. It was conviction that her survival was a sign of destiny fulfilled. The media fed this growing fire with relentless fervor. Front pages across the globe hailed her as the Miracle Queen, a phrase that instantly cemented itself in the public imagination. Headlines spoke of divine intervention, of fate bending to preserve the monarchy through her, and of a nation united behind one woman's survival. Television screens replayed her doctor's declaration alongside footage of cheering crowds, framing Catherine not merely as a royal figure, but as a living testament to endurance and grace. The press, once critical of her absence, now became her greatest amplifier, declaring her the rightful center of the monarchy's future. Opinion polls reflected the tidal wave of devotion. Numbers soared to unprecedented levels, with overwhelming majorities voicing their belief that Catherine, more than anyone else in the royal family, represented stability, compassion, and destiny. Support for King Charles dwindled further, while Catherine's approval eclipsed even William's, a staggering reality that revealed just how much the miracle had altered the crown's delicate balance. Advisors within the palace studied these figures with growing unease, recognizing that the public's cry was not merely admiration, but expectation. When Catherine finally stepped out for her first post-recovery appearance, the response was overwhelming. Tears streamed down faces in the crowd as they caught sight of her, radiant yet humble. Standing before them, not as a patient who had triumphed, but as a symbol of national renewal, chants broke out, echoing like thunder across the streets. "Long live Queen Catherine!" The sound was deafening, unrelenting, as if the people were attempting to crown her themselves in defiance of tradition. At that moment, the monarchy's hierarchy was turned inside out. The throne, though technically occupied, was already being claimed by the people's choice. Inside the palace, aides panicked. What had begun as a narrative of hope was spiraling into something far more disruptive. The chants, the banners, the headlines, each one eroded the authority of the reigning monarch and shifted it toward Catherine. Some warned of a dangerous precedent, where public passion could override centuries of royal protocol. Others quietly admitted that the monarchy had no choice but to adapt, for the nation had already decided where its loyalty lay. Catherine was no longer simply William's wife or the future Queen Consort. She had become the beating heart of the monarchy itself. The tide was unstoppable. Catherine's recovery had been interpreted as divine validation, and the people embraced her not out of duty, but out of genuine love and belief. The monarchy, for the first time in decades, found itself bound by the will of the crowd, and their message was unmistakable. The crown belonged not to those in power, but to the one who had risen from despair and been reborn as their queen of hope. But if the public crowned her with love, destiny itself handed her the moment that silenced every doubt. Standing before the cameras, Catherine's voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of destiny. "I was saved for a reason." It was more than gratitude. It was a declaration. Every syllable was deliberate, chosen with the poise of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment. She spoke not as a patient returned from the brink, but as a figure reborn, embodying strength, faith, and a quiet power that gripped the nation. Her words resonated like scripture, echoing across living rooms, screens, and headlines worldwide. The silence that followed was not mere respect, it was awe. The stillness of a people realizing history was being rewritten before their eyes. Catherine chose her language carefully. She spoke of resilience, of faith in unseen strength, of the trials that nearly consumed her, and the lessons she carried from them. "When darkness closes in," she said softly, "hope can still find a way." The world heard a speech of survival, but those closest to her recognized the deeper message. This was not simply personal reflection. This was the articulation of a new identity, Catherine stepping into a role far larger than that of princess, embracing a destiny that now felt unstoppable. The impact on her family was immediate and emotional. William, who had carried her suffering in silence, was visibly moved, his composure broken by tears of pride and relief. For him, her words were not just a public statement, but a private vindication, proof that the woman he loved had endured and emerged stronger than ever. Their children, too young to grasp the full weight of the occasion, reacted instinctively with smiles and wide eyes, their innocence amplifying the significance of the moment. In them, the future looked secure, as if Catherine's recovery had sealed not just her fate, but theirs as well. Yet within her trembling voice lay another layer, a subtle but unmistakable nod to Diana's enduring legacy. When Catherine spoke of continuing the work of compassion, of living not for oneself but for the people, many interpreted it as invoking the late princess's spirit. It was a thread that connected two women across time, binding their destinies and casting Catherine as the heir, not only to a crown, but to Diana's unfinished mission. The phrase, "I was saved for a reason," rang as more than survival. It was a promise to carry forward what had been left behind. The interpretation of her speech was swift and overwhelming. Commentators declared it a claim to queenship in everything but name. The public, already chanting Queen Catherine, now had words to match their conviction. In their eyes, she had accepted not just survival, but responsibility, stepping fully into the role of leader. To them, this was more than recovery. It was coronation by spirit, if not by ceremony. And yet, one absence from the event did not go unnoticed. Queen Camila was nowhere to be seen. Her silence, her lack of presence, sparked immediate speculation. Was it illness, choice, or protest? To many, her absence was confirmation of the growing fracture within the monarchy, a quiet acknowledgement that Catherine's light had already dimmed Camilla's shadow. The contrast between the cheering crowds for Catherine and the whispers about Camilla's no-show deepened the divide between two women who now represented opposite futures for the crown. In that single speech, the monarchy was altered forever. Catherine had transformed from a princess recovering from illness into the nation's chosen figure of destiny. Every word she spoke became etched into the public's memory, fuel for a narrative that would not be reversed. For the first time in generations, a member of the royal family was elevated not by decree but by sheer belief. And yet, even as Catherine spoke of gratitude and destiny, her doctor left the world with one final, cryptic warning. Just when the world thought the story had ended in triumph, Catherine's doctor leaned into the microphone and whispered words that froze the room. But the miracle has its price. The jubilation that had filled the air moments earlier dissolved into uneasy silence. His warning was not shouted, but delivered with a gravity that carried more weight than any celebration. Suddenly, hope collided with fear, and the miracle everyone clung to no longer felt unshakable. The suggestion that her recovery might not be permanent spread like wildfire. Behind the polished announcement, whispers of ongoing monitoring and hidden risks took root. Insiders hinted at conditions quietly attached to her survival, treatments that could not guarantee permanence, and tests that still loomed in the shadows. What was meant to be closure now became a prelude to uncertainty, an acknowledgement that fate had not yet spoken its final word. William's face told the story no words could. Anger flickered in his eyes at the intrusion of doubt into what should have been their moment of peace. Yet beneath the fury was unmistakable fear. He had already lived with the prospect of losing her once, and the doctor's cryptic warning reopened that wound. The monarchy, too, stiffened at the revelation. Advisors whispered of preparing for another storm, aware that the institution's newfound momentum could crumble if destiny turned against them once again. And so, Catherine's story remains unfinished, her miracle a beacon, her destiny uncertain, and her place in history already carved in whispers of both triumph and tragedy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.